Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We just heard a beautiful articulation of some of the material that we've learned over the last 4 months in the Bible. My words this evening will attempt to bring some of it, at least, to bear on its activization or utilization in today's rabbinical courts in Israel. Through my work at ITIM, I have the unique opportunity of participating in the development of the halachic process, and it's playing out in Israel in the rabbinical courts. And I want to give you 2 examples this evening of case studies where texts that we've been studying play a role in today's world. So I'm going to begin with the Gemara we studied in Yevamot on Daf Mem Hey Amud Bet. We grew up thinking that anybody who's born from a Jewish mother is Jewish, and in fact, despite the fact that Rabbi Akiva says that an intermarriage leads to mamzerut, we paskin in the Gemara on Daf Mem Hey Amud Bet, ve'ilchata goy ve'eved habal bat Yisrael. The halacha is that with regard to a Gentile or a slave who is with a Jewish woman, havlad kasher bein bepnuya bein be'eshet ish. Right, the offspring is kosher, and I'm going to come back to that word in a moment, whether she was an unmarried or married woman. This is a good example of what we call in Hebrew pisulei chitun, or people who are prohibited from getting married. And the Gemara makes it very, very clear that the child of an intermarriage where the father is not Jewish and the mother is Jewish is completely kosher. In fact, the Tosfot Yontif notes that this is the reason that Masechet Yevamot comes before Masechet Ketubot and not afterwards. Naturally, you might want to say that Ketubot would come first. After all, we should talk about marriages before we talk about getting out of marriages or what happens when a spouse dies. And the Rambam, in fact, says that unlike Yevamot, which happens and you're forced into it, Ketubot is something you would choose. But the Tosfot Yom Tov says, no. Before we get into Ketubot and marriages, we have to know who can't even engage in marriages. And this Gemara makes it very, very clear that the child of a Jewish mother would be Jewish, or would be kosher, I should say. What the Gemara doesn't tend to address, or doesn't address at all, is a question that came up already in the medieval period. Here, I cited it in the name of the Rif, a 11th century scholar from Morocco. When the Gemara says that the Vlad is kasher, hani mili li Yisrael. The strange, right, the sui generis word, the child is kasher, is somewhat strange. Why not just say the Vlad is okay to marry anybody? By saying the Vlad is kasher, it sounds like he's kasher to marry another Jew, another Israelite. Aval lekehuna, but regarding marrying a kohen, if a non-Jewish man had impregnated a Jewish woman and had a girl, that girl, in fact, would be prohibited from marrying a kohen. Havlad pagum. Di bartahi, if it's a daughter, asura la kohen. So says the Rif, some of his rabbis say that, in fact, the child of a Jewish man, a non-Jewish man, and a Jewish woman would be prohibited, a girl would be prohibited to marry a kohen. He continues and he says, other rabbis say the opposite. He says, I personally, I'm not 100% sure what to do with this case. Now, I want to make it very, very clear. For the last 1,500 years, the situation has almost never, ever come up. I want you to think about for a moment what kind of situation would have to happen for a non-Jewish man to have to impregnate a Jewish woman, have a daughter, and that daughter to come to marry a Kohen. The classic case, which again appears in some of the responsa literature, is you have a shtetl, or the equivalent of a shtetl, and a woman shows up with her daughter, right in tow. They move into the shtetl, they grow up, they marry off the daughter to a Kohen, and then the mother acknowledges at some point, after the marriage takes place, the mother acknowledges, hey, I didn't really tell you, but I was raped by the local nobleman, and I didn't want to tell anybody, and this is my daughter, who's the daughter of the local nobleman. What's remarkable, or even dramatic, about what's going on today in Israel is that statistically speaking, I should say, let me begin with that. Statistically speaking, this situation is going to obtain about 150 times this year. For the first time in Jewish history, starting only about 30 years ago, we have hundreds and hundreds of kids, daughters, who are children of intermarriages, whose fathers are not Jewish and mothers are Jewish, who are coming to get married in an Orthodox way, who are coming to get married to Kohanim. And the reason we have that is because of the blessed aliyah of almost 1 million or more than 1 million immigrants in the former Soviet Union, many, 70% of whom were intermarried. Many of them have daughters. Those daughters would be prohibited to Kohanim. But almost no one knows this situation. And because of that, I get calls. I continue to get calls. But starting about 15 years ago, I started getting calls in my office. The first time I got a call was from the head of the Reform movement, who called and said there was a couple who was his name was Mordechai Cohen. Her name, I don't want to use her real name, but she was an immigrant from the former Soviet Union. And they went into the rabbinate in Rehovot. They were sure that everything was okay. They asked him to prove he's Jewish. He said, no problem. My parents got married here in Israel. They asked her to prove she was Jewish. She brought out all the paperwork for her mom. They said, what about your dad? She said, oh, my dad's not Jewish, but I'm Jewish. No problem. And they wrote in the Psak Din from the Beit Din, they wrote she can marry anybody lebar mi kohen, which means except for a kohen. She thought that was a typo, and she thought it was supposed to say im rav mechayin, with the rabbi who could perform the wedding, which is like the same letters, but just a little out of the way, a little switched around. They walked in. She said, this is my fiance, Mordechai Cohen. It said here. They said, but it says here you can't marry a Cohen. She said, what are you talking about? They said, well, you can't marry a Cohen. Your father's not Jewish. Because in fact, that is the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch and Even HaEzer, the source that's in front of you, if a non-Jew marries or impregnates a non-Jewish Jewish woman, then havlad kasher. But we add what it doesn't appear in the Talmud, upagum lakuna. Now, there's a debate that it ensued already in the 16th and 17th century. What happens if not lechatchila, but b'diavad? What happens if not beforehand, but afterhand, post facto, we discover that the girl is not, her father is not Jewish. And in fact, the Achronim say, the Sefer Meirot Einayim on the Shulchan Aruch says, well, b'diavad already, we since the Rif already had a debate, he wasn't sure about this, so b'diavad we're willing to say, let them stay married. That was the standard thing 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago. A big debate has ensued in the last 30 or 40 years, and it's a debate that I've been involved in. By the way, in North America, I should say that Rabbi Bleich takes a very, very different position than the Israeli rabbinical courts and the position that I want to present here. But the question is, what does b'diavad mean today? What does post facto mean today? And I'm going to bring you a case. Mordechai, and in this case, Anastasia, right, ended up in the rabbinical courts in Tel Aviv with Rabbi Ben Shimon. And if you just go down a little, and Rabbi Ben Shimon, in his Psak Din, quotes a remarkable passage of Yoshua Ehrenberg, who was another rabbinical court judge in the Israeli rabbinical courts. He writes, he says, I think there's reason in absolute need to allow this couple to be married. It seems to me that there should be good reason to allow Mordechai Cohen and Anastasia to get married, even though Anastasia's father is not Jewish. And then he uses some very, very, very strong language. He says, Kevan shekvar hitkashra im Kohen be'avotot ahava. That means she's already connected with the Kohen with the bonds of love. What that means, and I don't mean this cynically, what I mean it, this is a halachic statement of the first order. He says basically, since they're living together, that is a reason to allow them to continue proceeding to get married. Hitarsaimo, they're engaged. It's rare, if ever, that what we call engagement, right, when the guy gave the girl a ring, but it has no halachic status, all of a sudden that takes on halachic significance. Ukvar omdot lenisuin, and then he says something remarkable. Yesh bazeh mishum aguna. If we weren't allowed them, if we were to prevent them from getting married, this isn't after they were married, this is before they were married. They come to the rabbinical court. In this case, I was representing them. And he says it would be an aguna situation. Because what does an aguna mean? An aguna means, again, without taking a moral position on this, but aguna means a woman who's unable to get married. Says Rabbi Ehrenberg, if we were to prevent this couple from getting married, who's to say they'd meet someone else? And therefore, if we don't allow them to get married, if we don't rely on the minority position, then in fact, she actually might end up becoming an aguna. The shayach mishum aguna afilu b'chi agavna. The matzia leminsev la'achrina. The shema lo timtza mishi yisaena. She might not ever find anybody to get married. And therefore, Rabbi Ben Shimon in Tel Aviv, and he in fact told me, he said to me, Shaul, he said, call me by my Hebrew name. He said, when you get cases like this, bring them to me. I know how to resolve these cases. You have hundreds of couples. Again, I've seen literally almost 1,000 couples probably who have had this situation where the father is not Jewish, the mother is Jewish, they fall in love with a Kohen. And Rabbi Ben Shimon said, I take this on my shoulders. I am going to interpret b'diavad in a very, very wide way. And because of that, I'm going to enable them to get married. I'm going to allow them to proceed. It's not after they got married. They're on their way to the chuppah. They're registering to get married. I'm going to allow them to do it. So that's a good example of where you have kind of a debate in the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot. And in today's world, we're able to apply that din, apply that law, and find solutions as well. I want to talk about one more area as well, very, very quickly. The first time that this phrase appears in the Gemara in all of Shas is in Masechet Yevamot. We just learned it a couple of weeks ago. The story in Narsh about the child, the minor girl who was married by her father, and then someone else stole her from the chariot in which she was on her way to her wedding. And eventually the rabbis come to the conclusion that Afkinu l'Rabbanan l'Kiddushim mineh. Hu asa shelo kahogen, right? That second guy came and took the girl inappropriately. Asu lo shelo kahogen. We treated him in a way that maybe wasn't befitting him, but we treated him in a way that he deserved, so to speak. He deserved it. Fafkinu Rabbanan l'Kiddushim mineh. The sages abrogated his betrothal. They basically undid his betrothal. Now this has been used and attempted to be used in all sorts of ways. We mentioned a couple of minutes ago the issue of aguna. Some rabbis have tried to discuss the fact that if a man refuses to give a woman a get, we should employ Afkinu l'Rabbanan l'Kiddushim mineh. That's somewhat controversial still today in the halachic discourse. But when we want to try to undo a marriage, particularly when it comes to mamzerut, when it comes to women who were married to one man and became pregnant by another man, we do engage in a form of what might be considered afkinu. It's not exactly the same mechanism as afkinu, but it is still the same principle of hu asa shelo kahogen and laseh bo shelo kahogen. And I want to give you one example of it. A number of years ago, I got a call from a young man who was a pretty senior officer in the army, in the IDF, who told me the following story. He walked into the rabbinate with his bride, and as you know, in this country, in Israel, there's no civil marriage. They're not an Orthodox couple, but they were going to get married in the rabbinate. And when they walked in, they said, okay, your paperwork looks good. They said, there, and your paperwork? They said to the man, you have a problem. You're actually a mamzer. He said, what are you talking about? They said, no, you're a mamzer. You have to go to the rabbinical courts. And then he called me and he said, I don't understand. I'm a pretty senior officer in the army. Don't you think that I've done a thing or two for this country? Don't you think they'd want to help me out? Instead, why are they sending me down some path? I don't know where it's going. What was his story? His mom came from North America, from Canada, in the 70s, came to Israel, and she fell in love. She didn't really know anybody here in the early 70s. There weren't a lot of North Americans here. She fell in love with a fellow whose family had made Aliyah from Morocco. The marriage didn't go well, and after a couple of months, it was very clear that the marriage wasn't going anywhere. At the time, she had gotten married. Her family had a couple of friends who were rabbis who had made Aliyah in the late 60s, and they were the witnesses of the wedding. They were basically the only people except for her parents that she knew at the wedding. And she basically walked away from the wedding. She asked her husband for a get. She knew that was important. The husband said, I'm not giving you a get. And she just went back to, she went back to Europe. Her family went back to Canada. And, his family went back to Canada, And he grew up in Europe. He came on Aliyah by himself. His family had a strong connection here. And when he got to Israel, he joined the army. And again, he worked his way up in the army. What happened? The mom, as I mentioned before, had left Israel. She didn't tell anybody in Europe that she had been married before. She met a guy who was not Orthodox. They just got married in a traditional Jewish ceremony, not an Orthodox ceremony. She never told anybody that she was married while she was married to the second guy. And she had brought this young soldier into the world, this young fellow who grew up, joined the army, etc. And the question then became, hey, what do we do with this fellow? Like, how can we help him? After all, the two witnesses were both Orthodox rabbis. This was a case that I brought to the rabbinical courts in Israel. And again, the rabbinical courts in Israel won't willy-nilly start engaging afkinu l'Rabbanan l'Kiddushim. They're not going to go and abrogate the first marriage, even though the first husband was treated her inappropriately, and really treated her inappropriately, and it was documented. But at the time, if I make a long story short, we ended up going to Rav Ovadia Yosef. Rav Ovadia Yosef, in a very remarkable, I would say even groundbreaking response, which I have, was basically written to me, and this is a copy of the tshuva, not as it appears in his books, but as it was written to me, went through what I would call halachic gymnastics to basically try to abrogate the first marriage, or to basically deny it. Instead of saying, we're going to take apart the first marriage, he wanted to argue that the witnesses were not kosher witnesses. The way he did this was by questioning what else the original witnesses did besides being rabbis. And it turned out one of them, making Aliyah in the 60s, had gone on to a legal career here in Israel. And here's Rav Ovadia Yosef's tshuva that, again, was issued in the rabbinical courts in Israel and ultimately carried the day and enabled this couple to get married. This was the mom who got married in the 70s, in the early 70s. After some time, she got divorced without a get. Right, the mom went back to Europe. She had a son. Before she got the get. The son grew up. He doesn't say that he was a soldier. This rabbi, this Orthodox rabbi, doesn't say he's a rabbi, but he's an Orthodox man, but he became a litigator in the Israeli secular court system. And then Rabbi Avodia Yosef goes on a rampage against lawyers. Anybody who uses the secular courts, and again, I hope there's no lawyers on the call, I'm sure there are, but he says anybody who does is an evil person, and it's like he cursed God, and he picked up his hand against the Torah of Moshe. And he says anybody who says that you can do it because of Dina de Malchut Adina, because the law of the land is law of the land, is wrong, and he's a robber, and he's an evil person. Essentially, if you're a lawyer, says Rav Ovadia, in this tshuva, essentially, you're not kasher for edut. Rav Ovadia even goes on to say, and he actually publicized this later on, right after he wrote this tshuva about this case. He actually says that everybody knows this because rabbis like himself went to the press and said that lawyers are basically, I don't want to say it, because I don't want anybody to get insulted, but lawyers are cheaters and robbers, etc., and therefore they're not able to provide witnesses. Now, right, this is not, again, what I want to try to show you in this case, which again is remarkable. You'd ask me, and I'll just make one quick comment about it. If you were married and your witnesses were lawyers, do not worry, you're still married. Rav Ovadia wrote this regarding one specific case. Again, he makes a general comment about lawyers, but what I want to try to show you is that when someone acted shelo kahogen, that line, when someone acted inappropriately, Rav Ovadia, they treated him inappropriately, and they basically said, it wasn't just you, but we're going to undo your marriage completely. And Rav Ovadia basically, in this instance, took apart the entire first marriage, basically declaring the first couple not married. That made the second marriage a valid marriage. And because of that, the child was, again, legitimate. So we've learned a lot in Masechet Yevamot about mamzerut. The rabbis try very, very, very hard. They're willing even to go to lengths like this to declare someone not, to unmamzer, if you will, someone who was declared a mamzer by the rabbinical courts. Again, what are the implications for this? I leave it to you to think about it. We can talk about it at some sort of different time. But these are remarkable applications of some of the principles that we've studied in Masechet Yevamot. For those of you who struggle in Masechet Yevamot or found it somewhat obtuse, again, you just heard a beautiful exposition by Dean Rachel Friedman about one dimension of Yibum and Chalitza. But the halachot, the specific halachot, they're still applicable today, but we do our best to use the principles that are there. The principles are principles of justice, principles of righteousness, principles of family, and most important, principle of bringing God's word into the world. So with that sense of application, I give you back to Rabbanit Michelle, but I hope that these few words have provided some inspiration about how this material can actually be applied in today's world in a meaningful way. Thank you.